she'll be here, but if it's another 5 minutes, then we don't want to keep other people waiting.
That's
So
fine.
I will go ahead. Good evening. The Town of Los Gatos Planning Commission meeting of Wednesday, June 22nd, 2022 is now called to order. Ms. Armour, would you please call the roll?
Thank you. Commissioner Raspy.
Here.
Commissioner Janoff.
Here.
Commissioner Clark.
Here.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Here.
Chair Hansen.
Here as well.
And let the record show that Commissioner Thomas and Commissioner Tavana are not with us at this time, but we'll update the record if either are available to join us.
Okay. Commissioner Tavana has let us know he's traveling, so he will not be attending. So, okay. And I will leave it with you, staff, to address the rules of decorum and civility for our meetings.
The public is welcome to participate in the meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meeting is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. For the benefit of the entire community, the Town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the agenda. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at board, commission, or committee meetings. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at board, commission, or committee meetings. All public comments at the board, commission, or committee meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the chair may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the commissioners exiting the chamber or meeting room. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the commissioners would return to the chamber or meeting room and the chair would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a board, commission, or committee meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code, Section 403.
Thank you for that. And with that, we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is verbal communications. The Town of Los Gatos encourages participation by the public in its meetings, and that participation can occur in a couple of forms. First is written communications. Written communications received through staff are always welcome and helpful. And we did have some written communications that came in for this meeting as well. And then we also have two opportunities to speak in verbal communications during our meetings. The first is during this time, we will take comments from the members of the public on items that are not on the agenda. And then during the hearing on any specific items, we can take comments that are on the agenda for that item. And we ask that you limit your comments to 3 minutes. And we do ask that you state your name and address for the record. However, it is perfectly acceptable to speak anonymously as well. Do we have anyone that would like to speak in verbal communications this evening?
Please raise your hand if you wish to speak on an item that's not on the agenda today. I don't see any hands raised, Chair.
Okay, then we will move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the consent calendar. Any member of the public or the Planning Commission may pull items that are on the consent calendar for hearing during the regular meeting. We do have one item on tonight's consent calendar, and that is the draft minutes of our June 8th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. Does any member of the public or the commission wish to pull the minutes for consideration as a regular agenda item? I don't see any commissioners and staff. We don't have anyone else. So I will ask if any commissioners have any changes that they want to recommend to the minutes. Otherwise, if there are no changes, I would like to get a motion to approve the consent calendar. Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. I move to approve the consent calendar as presented.
Thank you. And may I get a second? Commissioner Clark.
A second.
Thank you. And then I will do the roll call vote. And please answer yes, no, or abstain. Commissioner Raspy.
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
Commissioner Clark.
Yes.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. So it passes unanimously. And so then we can move on to our public hearings. And we have two public hearings this evening. And the first is requesting approval for construction of a new second-story addition to an existing single-family residence on property zone R1A, located at 147 Arroyo Grande Way, APN 424-23030, minor residential development application MR-21-027, property owner Ayan Mutlu, and applicant Bilal Liter, and project planner Sean Mullen. And I believe this item is a continuance of a hearing that we had at a previous meeting in which the applicant was supposed to come back and talk to us about certain items. But I will ask staff to address that. Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Chair. On May 25th, the Planning Commission considered the application and continued the matter with direction to the applicant to reduce the prominence of the second story by pushing the master bedroom and bathroom portion back away from the street to be more consistent with bedroom number 4. In response to the Planning Commission's direction, the applicant has revised the project, pushing the master suite back approximately 4 feet. This approach is more consistent with approach number 1 included in the consulting architect's report. The revised plans also include an increase to the lower level plate height at the kitchen and living room portion of the residence, and a revised layout of the master bathroom to facilitate the introduction of a pair of windows on the front elevation consistent with the front windows at bedroom number 4. The installed story poles have remained in place on the site, and additional blue netting was added prior to tonight's meeting to demonstrate the revised master suite location. This concludes staff's presentation, and we are available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. And I did neglect to ask, since there was a change to the story post, may I see a show of hands from commissioners that have been able to visit the site for the revisions? Okay, thank you for that. And I will ask if any commissioners have questions for staff at this time before we open it up to the applicant. I don't see any hands raised. Okay, and then we will turn it over to the applicant, who has up to 5 minutes to address the commission.
If you'd like to speak on behalf of the applicant, please raise your hand. All right, you should be able to unmute. Go ahead.
Okay. Could you please pull up the PDF that I emailed?
Yes, just a moment.
So, good evening, everybody. So I'd like to thank the Commission for your feedbacks, and I think this revision looks better than it used to. So let's, again, Sean nicely summarized everything, but I'm just gonna add some visual touch to what he has described. So the first change was essentially pushing the master suite by 4 feet, which is basically consistent with what the consulting architect has recommended. So right now it's almost aligned with the bedroom 4 wall. If you look at on the upper right side, you've got about a feet difference in between, and story pole changes actually do show that pushback. Next slide, please. The second change was the plate height of the addition, family kitchen addition. So on the upper left side, you see the original project, and the lower right side is the new one. I mean, no change in window heights or anything, and the overall structure height is the same. Nothing has changed except we pushed the plate height to 9 feet because we can't have vaulted ceiling anymore because this area going from the second story to the end of the house is too narrow. So what we're going to do is just basically a 9 feet plate height in the family plus kitchen area. So that is the change. And the last one was recommended by Commissioner Rasby. And basically what we did is we did a relayout in the master bathroom to accommodate the kind of symmetrical window structure on the master. And if you look at the roof under the master bath, we pulled the roof up so that it's kind of hiding the second story further. If you look at the left side, the roof is kind of at the bottom where we kind of pulled out the roof so that, we have this similar hiding, looks the same as what we have on the left side. So these are essentially the summary of changes. And again, thanks for your feedbacks. I think we are, we love this one better than the first one. And this is the landscaping plan I didn't get to review in the first meeting, but again, this is not final yet, but one thing I want to clarify is I have communicated with the neighbors, discussed with the neighbors about the hedges that you have on the sides of the yard. So that's basically what we're going to be installing. There are some trees that are laurel or ligustrum trees that are kind of not in good shape. We may remove some of them, but I will try to keep as many trees as possible. And also, since most of you have seen the house, you've probably seen the rose trees that I have in the front yard. So we'll keep those rose trees as well, or increase the count in the front yard. So that's pretty much it. And again, last slide, please. I want to thank all of our neighbors who supported us in this project. I mean, all of them. We really appreciate their friendship. And Jennifer Armour, I'm not sure if you remember me, but I asked you, many questions about almost a year and a half ago. And Sean Mullen, of course, for his tirelessly answering our questions and phone calls and etc. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And I will ask if any commissioners have questions for the applicant. Commissioner Raspi.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to thank the applicant for, it's clear that they listened to our comments and incorporated our comments into the revised design. So thank you for making those efforts. Just one question. Have you shared these updated drawings with your neighbors? And if so, have you heard any feedback from them?
Yes, we did. We did share the updated drawings. I mean, like especially front view. We had a Memorial Day barbecue in one of our neighbors' home, so we did discuss them. Yeah, they are okay. There are no specific feedback.
Okay, thanks so much for your response.
Yeah.
Do any other commissioners have questions for the applicant at this time? Okay, there will be another opportunity when after we take public comments. So I will turn it to public comments at this point in time. Would any members of this public like to speak on this item?
If anyone would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand. I don't see any hands raised, Chair.
Okay, very good. Then I will go back to the applicant. And although I know you had an opportunity to address most of the things that you wanted to talk about, you do have an opportunity for another 3 minutes to speak to the commission before I close the public hearing.
Nothing, just my wife and I would like to thank you. That's all. Thanks.
Okay. And then I will do a last call with the commissioners for any questions that you might have for the applicant before I close the public hearing. Okay, I don't see any commissioner hands raised, so I'm going to close the public hearing and I will turn to the commission to see if you have any questions of staff, any comments on this application, or if you are ready to make a motion, that is fine as well. Let's start with Vice Chair Barnett and then Commissioner Clark.
I have a question of staff. There was a recommendation of denial at the original hearing based on size, height, and bulk of the project. And I was wondering if that still remains. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Staff typically doesn't make a different recommendation in situations like this, so the recommendation would be forwarded.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Clark.
Thank you. During the second site visit, I was kind of disappointed when I saw it. Like, I didn't think that it looked that different being further set back, but seeing their designs and the other changes that they've made, I do think that the project looks a lot better and that they did a good job reducing the mass. I especially like how they raised the roof at the bottom. I thought that did a really good job of reducing the mass, and that's just my comments.
Okay, thank you for that, Commissioner Clark. But Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd just like to echo that I'm very pleased that the applicant has taken the recommendation of the Planning Commission and gone a little farther to make the changes. And I'm very pleased that the applicant finds that the new design is even better than their original design. That's always a win-win. So I would be in favor. And I just a comment to Commissioner Clark. It's always difficult to get the sense of the dimensions of an elevation from the story poles. It's just really tough because it just doesn't give you anything to really visually hang your eyes on. So it really does give you outlines and yeah, it's really important that we get the elevations and the renderings from the applicant. I appreciate those. They always make a difference. So I'm in favor of approving this project as currently designed.
Okay, any other comments or questions from commissioners? Commissioner Raspy, was that a question?
Sorry, there's a quick,
okay.
Yeah, I echo Commissioner Janoff's comments, and if the chair is willing, I'm willing to try a motion.
Go ahead.
So I would move to approve applicant's request for approval of construction of a new second-story addition to an existing single-family residence on property zoned R-1:8, located at 147 Arroyo Grande Way, as more specifically set forth in applicant's updated application.
Okay, and do we have a second? Oh, Vice Chair Barnett.
Be happy to second that.
Okay, and Ms. Armorer has a question or comment?
Just to clarify that the motion includes the findings and conditions.
Oh, thank you for that.
It does, thank you.
Okay, and then Vice Chair Barnett has commented. Before I called the question, I did want to make a comment that that at the previous hearing, I was in favor of a size reduction because the reasons that staff had originally recommended denial and the reason that this had come to us were really because the size of the house was too big for the neighborhood and would be setting a precedent in the neighborhood. So even though I'm really happy to see that the applicant made the changes that we recommended, and I know that the commission did not want to go there in terms of requesting a size reduction, I won't be supporting the vote, but it seems like there's enough support from the commission. And, clearly I did want to give credit to the applicant for addressing all of the concerns that were recommended by the commission as a whole. So then I will call the question and I will start with Commissioner Raspy.
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
Commissioner Clark.
Yes.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes.
And I vote no, but it does pass 4-1. And are there any appeal rights for this action by the commission?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The decision of the commission can be appealed to town council by any interested person as defined by town code section 2910.020 within 10 days on forms available online and with fees paid. Appeals can be filed with the town clerk by 4 p.m.
Thank you very much for that. So with that in mind, we will move on to the second public hearing, which is to review and make a recommendation on the draft objective standards to the town council. And we did receive a draft of the draft objective standards, as well as a desk item from Vice Chair Barnett with some comments that came along with the forwarding of the draft or the actual document that Palo Alto has published for itself. And so I will turn it over to staff and have you take it from there.
Great, thank you again, Chair. Before you tonight is a review of the draft objective standards for recommendation to the Town Council. The Town of Los Gatos has developed objective standards for the review of multifamily and mixed-use development applications in order to comply with recent state housing legislation, implement streamlined and ministerial review processes for qualifying housing projects, ensure that these qualifying projects align with the town's expectations and visions to maintain and support the character of the town, provide a set of clear criteria to guide development, and establish an objective framework for which a qualifying project may be evaluated. In collaboration with our consultant M Group, the draft objective standards were developed following a review of state legislation and existing town documents, consideration of recommendations received during 5 Planning Commission subcommittee meetings, and consideration of feedback received during 2 community engagement meetings. An addendum and desk item have been distributed, including input from planning commissioners and a summary of the issues considered by the subcommittee. Tom Ford, a principal at M Group, will now provide more detail on the development of the draft objective standards, as well as present the structure and the content of the draft document. Staff, along with Tom and his team, are available to answer any questions and aid in tonight's discussion. Tom?
Thank you, Sean. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. It's great to be here tonight to talk about this this product, this great document that I'm sure you'll have lots of comments on. Sean already went over a little bit about this, but I just have a very, very brief presentation to cover these 4 items and then allow you folks to discuss what you see and give us some feedback. So first, I want to just make sure everybody's on the same page about why we're doing this, and a lot of it's reacting to recent state legislation, particularly regarding housing and affordable housing. I want to go over a little bit of the process that we use to develop the document that you've had now for a few days to review. Just discuss the development topics, how we organize the document, and then allow you to have time for discussion. So we started, as the staff report noted, we started a while ago, and we first started gathering background information and started having that series of meetings with a subcommittee of the Planning Commission, 3 people, 2 of which I think are here with us tonight. And went through a lot of discussion, really examining a lot of the subjective design guidelines existing in present town documents, and I'll get into that in just a moment. Following those subcommittee meetings, we basically had sort of a to-do list. And so what we did was we boiled that into different kinds of groups of development or design typologies, if you will, and took that to a community meeting. So we didn't even have a draft document yet. We had what we called preliminary ideas, I think it was called. And it was just ideas that we had heard from the subcommittee and how we might develop them for projects that were applicable. Following that meeting, then we started to develop a draft right before your Spring Green event, I think you call it, right before that event. We released it to the public. It was at that event. It was at a booth that the planning staff had, and so people could start to see it. About 10 days after that event, we had the second community meeting, continued to take comments, but now people were reacting to an actual draft document as opposed to the development concepts that we thought we would tinker with. And then we get into the second day of summer tonight, and here we are. As we predicted, summer 2022, we're before the Planning Commission, so we're going to start to let you guys give us some ideas, some reactions, and eventually end up in front of the town council, where we hope they will consider it for adoption. So again, Sean went through some of these 5 bullet points. A lot of this is coming from state housing legislation that I'm sure you've discussed in various contexts over the last couple or 3 years. Our way of doing it at M Group is we really try to boil down or dig down into what are the existing planning documents that a community has already adopted and developed for itself, because those speak to really how the community thinks about itself. It's the documents that you folks in your review process rely on to give ideas to applicants, such as the one earlier tonight, push that second floor back. And then we need to provide objective criteria to match some of that state legislation. One of the most known ones is SB 35. There's a lot of legislation. There's new legislation right now pending that they're still discussing, anything from raising the maximum height of an ADU from the current limit, parking, where is parking allowed? So parking around transit. There's a lot of new laws that are going to continue to come down, we think, and they're going to have a stipulation that the only thing that can that a community can use to regulate the development proposal will be objective standards. However, on the other side of that, it provides a lot of certainty to the developers, because they then really know what are the rules, how do I achieve them, and here's my my application. And then, of course, all of this is about the state's goal to increase multiple family housing. So what are objective standards? This is taken directly from SB 35. It's the definition the state uses. It's the definition you've seen in every community who's doing this. They rely on this, because what the objective standard has to have is it has to remove any kind of personal judgment, so that when the development proposal is in front of the staff member at the counter and there's a objective standard, it's really easy to, well, it's clear to tell, do you meet the standard or not? And because those two people with potentially differing viewpoints have to agree on something. So everything has to be an objective judgment rather than a subjective response. And what that sets up is the ability for town staff to do ministerial review of projects that come in and meet the requirements of an affordable project or some other kind of project that state law has said these are only subject to objective standards. So that ministerial review on the right side is going to be happening. What we're trying to do with the document is try to find ways to get all of the other stuff on the left side. For instance, my impression of what happened on your first item tonight is some previous meeting, you folks as a body asked the applicant to go away and push the second floor back. Well, what we've been trying to do is to see, is there a way to write an objective standard that does that? The difference is you had the benefit of looking at one property on, one design on one property. We have to write the standard that would apply across, the entire R2 zone or the entire R4 zone or what have you. So we can't be as specific as a discretionary review will be, but we can still try to find ways with the appropriate metrics to put those kinds of rules in place. So again, just discretionary on the left, ministerial on the right. This is what happens. Design guidelines tend to be very subjective. I think the subcommittee, we went through probably 400 different subjective design guidelines from various town documents. Many of them were duplicative, but they tended to be subjective, and sometimes a subjective guideline is just impossible to objectify. Eyes on the street, how would you do that? So, but maybe there's a way to measure how much windows there should be. And you have one of those before you tonight, one of the standards towards the end of the document. Design guidelines tend to have recommendations. They're just not necessarily enforceable. And they don't necessarily have a measurable aspect to them. The objective standards, as I spoke about earlier, have a metric. There needs to be a way that it's clearly objective. So these are some of the town documents that we reviewed, and it's really important that you know that these documents are still your town documents because you're going to need them for discretionary review. So these documents aren't going anywhere. They were just the starting point for us to take subjective information, subjective guidelines in all of these various documents, not so much in the town code, but all of these documents, and start to bring it together. We sorted it into the like-minded groups, if you will, setbacks, building mass, things like roofs, things like that, and then started to have those discussions. The one thing that's not really a document, and that's Gpac Referrals. This was how we started our project, probably about 6 months after the Gpac kind of finished going through, looking at some drafts of the general plan. And so what had happened is the community character element had a lot of information in it that the Gpac decided to pull out, but then the Gpac chair and vice chair referred that information to us. And so even that got put into that big list of 400 odd things that we looked at for possibilities for how to objectify. So I have 3 slides here that'll just talk about the process we went through, because it kind of breaks into 3 different areas. There's the sort of the preliminary stage where we took those town documents and the consultant team, got our hands around them and tried to understand what they were, worked with staff to get that material ready to have those subcommittee discussions that went on, stretched across a few months, couple of months. And then that's what delivered the preliminary topics that we took to that first community meeting. So the preliminary topics were made available on on the town website, a page specifically dedicated to this project. And then we had the community meeting on Zoom, took some comments, answered questions, and then went away and started drafting that document. So the first draft, that very preliminary draft, was a combination of information we received from the subcommittee and then supplemented by questions and comments that we heard from the community. Once we had that draft, it had started out as an admin draft. Staff picked through it and looked at it and had a lot of comments, and we cleaned it up and we got comfortable with publishing a public review draft. And that's the one that came out right around Spring Green and in advance of community meeting number 2. So following community meeting number 2, we took some comments and then we revised that draft document together with staff, revised some of the graphics, and got the draft together that's before you tonight. So that's here for your review. We'll hopefully have a great discussion with you about it tonight, or suggestions or ideas you have, questions, and at some point get in front of the town council for them to consider it for adoption. So the way the document that you have before you tonight is lined up, there's a lot in the first section, site design, but then there's quite a bit in the second section too, particularly in the 4th part, facade design and articulation. So all of these different pieces, they've changed a little bit in the process of how we broke it out, how we divided the document. Parking structure design in the building design part used to be just a subset of parking structure access. We talked about it all. With staff, we started talking about, let's talk about the access part in the site design, and let's talk about the building. And the subcommittee actually talked a lot about the facades of parking structures and such. Let's put the building part in the building design part. So that's one of the ways this changed as the process rolled along. So what it's obviously your decision, but what I suggest is, I can minimize this PowerPoint and I can pull up the document and I can scroll through it if you'd like, and you go to a specific place that you folks might want to have a conversation about. And then, or you do whatever you want to do. And then I just want to let you know, you're probably aware that document has a lot of images in it like this. Now, we drew these specifically, tried to draw them very plain. I don't want to say bland, but we tried to draw them plainly because we really just wanted to illustrate the text that's in the standard. So we're not trying to provide architectural design with these. We're just trying to say, what does it mean when you say that you can't have more than a 30-foot interval before you have this intervention of the facade plane moving 2 feet? So we realized that some of you or some of us, and all of us, anyone, member of the public might have an difficulty understanding, well, what does that really look like? So for almost, I think every time you see an image like this in the document, we've gone forward and tried to find a totally atmospheric image. It's not, we're not saying this is what Los Gatos needs. We're just trying to illustrate that concept. And like any photograph, there's always going to be something that's wrong. So for instance, I think in your town, it's not legal to build a fence this high out in the front setback. But what we were trying to illustrate was that modulating of the front facade and how that happens here and how it happens in the real world. Here's a 2-story townhouse version, and here's a 4-story stacked flat version. So again, just trying to show that real architects, particularly talented ones, can take an idea like this and move with it and create something, hopefully with the help of these objective standards, hopefully something that the town can then be proud of when the building is done and up and occupied. So I have these for any issue that has a diagram in with the little yellow pieces. And we've credited all the architects where we found these photographs, and we've generally relied on pretty good, Piatok, David Baker, pretty good multifamily designers, architects. So again, I'm not saying that this is an image you want to see in Los Gatos. I'm just saying, how do you actually illustrate? How would an architect build that concept? So with that, I'll hand it back to the chair, and I'll let you see if you like my idea of me pulling up the standards to spin through. But I'm available to do whatever you'd like.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Ford. I kind of think that there might be some big picture questions from the commission. And I did, before I take questions or suggestions or comments from the commission, I did want to let the commission know that the 3 people that were on the objective standards subcommittee were myself and Vice Chair Barnett, and then former Commissioner Birch. And we did, as noted, make the 5 meetings where we went through all of the standards that basically had been pulled out by the consultants for us to look at. And what we tried to do is determine if it was possible to make them more objective. And so there was obviously some things that weren't possible. And then where there were, we pulled those out. But before I ask commissioners for other questions, so I did not know what the ultimate format of the document would be. So what I wanted to ask was, from a developer's perspective, we obviously already had some objective standards and still do have objective standards that are in the resident documents that you mentioned. And then we have this standalone document for objective standards. And so how is that going to be clear to developers? I mean, I know our staff will always work with the developers, but you're going to use these documents side by side because we already have the objective standards in the general plan, the zoning code, and so on and so forth. How does that process going to work?
Thank you for that question. It's alluded to in the introduction statement on the front page, and this is a draft document, so we expect that introduction could change as we move through it. But ultimately, a qualifying project would need to meet these objective standards and other existing objective standards. If there is a case where one standard in this document for instance, is more strict than a standard in the town code than the standard in the draft document would rule.
Okay, that partly answers my question. So what, just playing it back the way I think I heard is that, and I did read the introduction, but I mean, basically, this is going to be something that's going to give us more tools, but that's not going to change the process that we already have, which is we're going to be pulling out our zoning code, our general plan, and other things in addition to this document. And this might make it easier for them to get a ministerial review because we have more parts of the architecture and site that would be objectified. Is that the right? Okay. Are there any other larger picture questions versus, comments of specific standards in the documents? I think there would be Vice Chair or Commissioner Jana.
Just regular Commissioner.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that this is a set of objective standards that really is for qualifying multifamily and mixed use projects. In other words, we wouldn't be applying these objective standards, for example, to the application that we heard in item number 2. Just wanted to clarify that this is for a different nature of building altogether. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's applicable to very specific product types.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to comment back to what Mr. Ford described as the process gleaning from the town documents and why using the town documents to pull forward to objective standards makes really good sense to me when you describe it as leaning on the information that the town already uses. So it's familiar information, and we're not going too far afield in terms of what might be used in the past. It just really tightens up what the town is already using. So I appreciated that as a clarifying point. Thank you.
Very good. Commissioner Raspy and then Vice Chair Barnett.
Thank you, Chair. For staff, I just want to confirm. So we have the objective standards, which leads to a ministerial administration of applications. It's my understanding that there also will still exist discretionary review if an applicant so elects to go that route, if they want to come outside of the objective general standards. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then it may or may not be a related question, but you've used the language qualifying multifamily and mixed use projects in the introduction, and I think it appears throughout the objective standards. What does qualifying mean in that sense?
Thank you. It has to do, and Tom, you may be able to add more to this, but it has to do with the number of residential units involved in a multifamily or mixed use development. I believe the minimum is 3, but I'd have to it's been a day of looking at a lot of different things. So I think the minimum is 3.
Right. And thank you. Right. And it's also, excuse me, like the levels of affordability that are offered in the project that's being put forth. And that will differ from town to town, depending on where you are in your annual report to HCD about how you're doing with providing affordable housing. So different towns and cities will meet different standards. And so when I see that language, it just means anybody who is eligible with an affordable project to come forward and only be judged in a ministerial process by objective standards. These would be the objective standards. And I believe, Sean, just to put a fine point on what you said, I believe because of the Housing Crisis Act or SB 330, it's actually any project that's 2 units and above. It can still go through a discretionary process, but it can't be denied if it meets all of the objective standards. So it would need to meet all of the objective standards also, but it doesn't have to go through a 60-day ministerial process.
Thanks, guys. That's very helpful.
Vice Chair Barnett.
So also for staff, I believe in the subcommittee meetings, there was some discussion about amending the town code and the residential design guidelines and the commercial design guidelines following adoption of the objective standards. And am I right in that regard?
Thank you for that question. You're right, that was discussed. The intent at this point is that this would be a standalone policy document. And the intent at this point is not to amend any other documents unless it's just to reference that this document does exist.
Okay, Commissioner Clark and then Commissioner Janoff again.
I'm not exactly sure how to ask this, but I'm kind of wondering what happens with something that is not mentioned in the objective standards if a project meets all of them. So like, for example, one of the things that made me think of this was Vice Chair Barnett's document talked about loading docks, which our objective standards hadn't talked about. And so how would that have been handled, like, say, if we don't incorporate it?
Thank you. If to take that specific example, if a loading dock came up, there's some guidance in the town code about, I think, locations of those types of things. I would mention that this is a living document, and over time, as these projects roll through the town, if items that had not been identified in this document at this point come up, staff will continue to make note of those. And as we do every so often with the hillside development standards and guidelines or residential design guidelines, we could return to amend the document and correct anything that was unintended or omitted.
Okay, yeah, so one of our goals is also to try to think of everything that we can to have it in there ahead of time almost.
That's part of the goal tonight, and also to use your example again, if the majority of the commission wants loading docks addressed, that can be part of the recommendation to the town council, and staff can work on that as we forward the document to the town council.
Thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair, or not, Commissioner Janoff. Commissioner Janoff is Vice Chair of the Housing Advisory Board, so I apologize for that. But today she's Commissioner Janoff.
Yes, Commissioner. Couple of comments. One, I wanted to loop back to Mr. Ford's illustrations of the different plane forms in actual lifestyle photographs. I think it's a really good idea to include that. We had some comments in our addendum, I think, that indicated that these forms look pretty bleak and they don't have any imagination to them. And are we forcing developers to design all of the beautiful features out of building space? And I think part of that comment is driven by the simplicity of the diagrams. And so having illustrations, even if they aren't perfectly fitting Los Gatos' standards, I think is a really good idea. People need to see that visual. It's sometimes challenging without that. So I would like to see that included. And then back to the question of what isn't in this document, and something that the Planning Commission hears a lot, I won't say every project, but many, many projects, is with respect to the protection of views. And so I'd like to know, I know this is an extremely difficult, it's an extremely difficult topic to create an objective standard around because the views are so subjective. My question is, was that considered, and are there any jurisdictions that you know of, like Tahoe, Woodside, some of the more bucolic settings, in addition to Los Gatos, that do have an objective standard regarding views or view protection, whether it's building height, which is something we probably wouldn't want in this document because you don't want to further limit what the developers can do, especially for mixed use and affordable housing. So we don't want to add government regulations there. But can you just comment on views and how possible or not possible it is to create a standard objective around that?
I can briefly respond to that and then pass it on to Tom. I'm not aware of other cities or jurisdictions that have pursued views of the objective standards, but I surely haven't read as many of these documents as Tom has, so I would default to him. And one other thing to note was the intent of the images that Tom has provided today to run parallel with the diagrammatic illustrations was not to be put into the document necessarily, but to illustrate the purpose and how those sort of plain images can be realized in real life. That could be part of your recommendation moving forward, that images be sourced moving forward for inclusion in the document, but we would have to source royalty free or hire someone to create those images. And with that, Tom, I'm not sure if you have any response about the view piece.
Sure. Thank you. We did discuss it at least 2 meetings of the subcommittee. I think first of all, you have to separate, are you talking about a view from the property out, or are you talking about a view from different parts of town up onto the hillside and the slope? Generally, one of the reasons we stayed away from it with the committee was because since you don't have a view shed protection ordinance or any kind of a view ordinance, it would be hard for us to start making regulations against a moving target, if you will. Because our office is doing a number of these objective standards throughout the Bay Area, I've been also tracking other communities. I know in Sausalito, as they were trying to develop their objective standards, they wanted to have some sort of view protection ordinance. And it became just a really hard nightmare for them because the view just changes from property to property. And as I said in my presentation, we're trying to make a standard that applies, to all R4 properties or all downtown commercial properties or whatever. So it's kind of hard. And they did a lot of studying of different moving parts. And it's really difficult just because it is so subjective. And so trying to establish an objective rule gets very, very difficult.
Thank you. I appreciate those responses.
Following up on Commissioner Janoff's question, you did mention one jurisdiction that was going in this direction. Are there other jurisdictions in California that are also very scenic that have been successful in doing this? I mean, because you did refer to a view ordinance. So do we know of other communities that would have a view ordinance and have been successful with it?
Yes. First, let me correct myself. Sausalito started down the road. They didn't finish. I don't think they finished their objective standards document without tackling that issue. So they tried. I can't name communities offhand, but I know there are communities, I want to say Chico, where view protection ordinances exist. Again, I can't think of a jurisdiction right offhand, but starting with that ordinance, that's where I would start before trying to write objective standards for something that's movable.
Right. So for the rest of the commission, we did discuss this during the subcommittee, and I do recall that that was the guidance we were given is about the view ordinance. So if we do want to go there in terms of our recommendation to council, that would probably be the thing to do, is recommend that the council look into trying to put together a view ordinance. On the devil's advocate side of that, since I'm chairing the Housing Element Advisory Board, and we're getting ready to, the town council is getting ready to finalize the general plan. We are relying very heavily on mixed use in both the housing element and the general plan for success in terms of meeting our RENA allocation. And the only way to that mixed use can be successful is through additional height and sometimes additional FAR and some other times some other things on top of that, and those might directly impact views. So I would say if we're going to recommend that to town council, we have to understand that it might be complicated by the fact that when we're building 4 stories and maybe even 5, that it will be hard to protect those views. So let me see if there's other big picture questions. Since Vice Chair Barnett had submitted his comments, I did want to at least bring up that we were forwarded a copy of Palo Alto's objective standards, and also Vice Chair had submitted some comments on top of that of things that he thought were important after reviewing that. Since Palo Alto's standards are so much longer than ours, how should we think about that? I'm going to ask staff that.
Thank you. And Palo Alto's ordinance that they created around objective standards, I would attribute part of the length of that ordinance is that it tries to capture two things, and you might recognize some of the language in there. First is they have their objective standards for these same types of qualifying projects. The second piece is they'll have an objective standard and what's called a context-based design criteria, which lies, they're usually similar concepts. The objective standard is just that, it's objective, and it can be applied to those projects that qualify. These context-based design criteria are for projects that don't meet the objective standards or choose not to utilize that process. And they did a much more robust overhaul and drafting of a document, and an overhaul of their town or city ordinance, and incorporated it into a new chapter. And I think that having the two running parallel creates a much longer document. A through line to what they've set up to the town of Los Gatos is that we are developing an objective standards process as a standalone policy document that would not live within the town ordinance. And for those projects, to Commissioner Raspi's question, to those projects that wouldn't meet those objective standards or choose not to, they would pursue the typical architecture and site process, similar to Palo Alto's context-based design criteria. And to your question, Chair, if there are items or concepts or particular objective standards, or even the design criteria that, I'm not sure if you can still hear me because I think I just lost my, yes, thank you.
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. I just got the notice in my ear. If there are particular items in that document that, or in their ordinance that you would like to pursue, you can include those as recommendations, even if they're not objective at this point. We can attempt to make something objective. We can look at whether it would create a conflict within the document, and we can redraft language, or it could be additive, or it could revise existing language. I think some of the examples that Commissioner Bardet, Vice Chair Bardet provided tonight, we have addressed in our document. Maybe not the same way. We may have gone about it a different way, but we have addressing something like pedestrian access, for instance. But you could certainly pull from Palo Alto or any other document, or any other concept in general, and include that in your recommendation as we move forward.
Okay, and so with that in mind, Vice Chair Barnett, you did submit your own recommendations, and it sounds like staff has gone through those. I mean, how would you like us to consider those in tonight's hearing? Ms. Armour has her hand up.
Sorry, Chair, but just wanted to remind you that we do have some members of the public. And so once you are done with overarching questions, we might see if they've got comments to share.
I was planning to do that. That was one of the ones I wanted to, that's one of the reasons I wanted to go over the overarching comments. And then the other thing is that if it's not in the document now, then this would be a time to bring those up versus going through the document and saying, you know, I wish it said this instead of this. It's if you think something's missing, it's probably good to bring those up now. So that was the reason for my questioning, but after that I will go to public comments. So my question was for Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, the document from Palo Alto is rather daunting, and there's some sentiment that we shouldn't continue tonight's hearing for the purpose of further examination of that document. And so Community Development Director Paulson had an excellent suggestion, which is that we forward that as a recommendation for review by the town council and not try to make any decisions tonight in the short amount of time that's available.
Okay, so that might be a way to do that. I mean, I relative to the finding of the Palo Alto document, I do imagine a scenario where any number of jurisdictions will come out with their documents, and then we might be like, oh, I wish ours looked like that. And so, you know, I do have that concern about, you know, kind of trying spend too much time tracking other documents, but since this one's in front of us, I think it would be helpful if any commissioners have specific things that they want us to our staff to consider as we move forward, that we should try and get those on the table as soon as possible. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to public comments. So this would be a time for any members of the public to speak about the draft objective standards that is on the agenda that we're discussing currently.
So if anyone is interested in speaking on this item, please raise your hand. All right, just a moment. Lee Quintana. You should be able to unmute. You have 3 minutes.
Yes. Number one that I would like to speak to is the fact that at the previous meetings on this, it was stated that there would be one unified document that included all the objectives that applied to the qualifying projects. And that seems to have been gone by the wayside. I do think that if you don't do that, it is going to be totally confusing to the public. They're not going to understand what exactly is included for these standards, and I do believe, as has been suggested, that you need to define in the document what a qualifying project is. As for photos, I think that to really, for the public to understand, and this document should not just be for the developers, to understand the concepts, that you need to include either a photograph or probably even better, a graphic figure of what you're trying to present. I think it sounds like, from what's being said, that this is going to go to the town council fairly rapidly, and that doesn't seem like giving either the public or the commission adequate opportunity to really digest what is being proposed and what could be proposed. Myself, I have not had a chance to look at the Palo Alto example. But the one thing I really believe is it has to be an integrated document that all the objectives that apply are listed. You may not have to actually quote them, but you at least have to give the direction as to where they can be found specifically by section, document, page, or whatever. Otherwise, the document is not user-friendly and is not transparent to the public. And I guess so that is going to basically be my statement right now. I think we need to pay more attention to how the documents are understood and perceived by the public so that they can understand the process and what is actually being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Quintana. And I'd like to ask if any commissioners have questions for Ms. Quintana.
Did I use up my time? Because I have one more comment.
You have additional 30 seconds if you'd like.
Okay, yeah. My other comment is that this document apparently, at my understanding anyway, can cover multifamily projects that contain duplexes on up to multifamily structures, large multifamily structures. And so there are a whole bunch of different types of buildings that are being covered, and yet the objectives don't break that down as to what applies to what building type. So again, I think that it needs better clarification for that, both to the understanding by the public and even by developers themselves. Thank you.
And thank you for your comments. They're always very, very helpful, and we really appreciate you talking to us. Any questions for Ms. Quintana? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to ask if there's anyone else that would like to speak on the draft objective standards.
If you'd like to speak on this item, please raise your hand. I don't see any other hands raised, Chair.
Okay. All right, then I will close public comments and go back to the commission. Ms. Quintana brought up the, a more specific version of what was on my mind when I asked the question earlier about how does this process work. And so I would like to say that I appreciated her comment. And I don't know where the rest of the commission is on this, but I do think there would be some merit to having a more comprehensive thing, even if we're pulling things out of code or whatever, so that people would know what all the objective standards were. I think that's not a bad thing to consider. So I'll just put that out there from my point of view. And then, are there other things that the commission would want to bring up in terms of the things that are missing, or structural issues or other things? We can also go through the document itself. But I wanted to see if anyone had any specific concerns about the overall structure and the direction that this is going. I think that there was a couple comments about having pictures. And I don't know what staff wants us to do. Should we vote on if there's specific recommendations, or just if it seems like we have consensus from the commission, we can forward that on as a recommendation? How does staff want us to do that?
Thank you, Chair. I can jump in. I would say that there are a couple different ways that you could proceed. If, as you're talking through, there are certain recommendations that you want to make individual motions about to see if there is consensus and support, then you could do it that way. Or you could keep track as the discussion goes on and have a list of additional changes, modifications, or additional material that you think should be provided to town council, and consolidate that in a single motion at the end of the discussion.
Okay, all right. Vice Chair or Commissioner Janoff, you had your hand up and you don't anymore, so your question is answered.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, if we're going to walk through the document, then, you know, there are opportunities for recommendation. But I think Ms. Quintana's point about having a, you know, it could be a drawing, it doesn't need to be a photograph, but something that better illustrates different types of design standards would be helpful. So.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'm okay with going ahead and looking at the document if you want to put that on the screen.
Are we seeing it?
Yes.
Okay. I can zoom out a little. I mean, zoom in, I guess. That's too much. So do you literally want to scroll through the entire document, or does somebody want to raise a specific standard that they'd like to discuss, and I can flip to it?
Well, I'm presuming that everyone on the commission has read the draft document, so I don't know that we need to go everything, but maybe what we did with the general plan and what we've done with the housing element so far is kind of go by section and see if there's things. And we did this in the subcommittee as well. I think we didn't talk about every last thing, but we went through a section and said, are there things that that caught our attention that we want to talk about? So I will ask Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. I had minor comments throughout that I'll just offer on 1.2 on this page. we talk about a height, but we don't mention depth. And I'm wondering whether there might be an addition of, so it's a height of 6 inches and a depth of, I don't know if it's 2 feet or what it might be.
Okay.
Right. Seems like a good suggestion. Okay, so is this, I don't have my whole document open in front of me, but is this everything under pedestrian access, or is that just the first page?
Yeah, that's it for pedestrian access. The next page will start into the second section, vehicular access.
Okay. Commissioner Janoff, did you have another comment? Okay.
I don't. It's
Okay.
just part of the split screen for me to get to the lower hand and raise hand.
Vice Chair Burnett, you have your, did you have a question about the pedestrian access or vehicular access?
Pedestrian access. I wanted to point out in my suggestions of possible modifications based on the Palo Alto objective standards, item 2, there's a hierarchy of access issues for prioritizing pedestrian, bikes, and vehicles in that order. And I wonder if we could consider that as a possible modification.
So just to make sure that it's clear what you're asking. So the Palo Alto, they were saying that you would prioritize certain modes of transportation over, like, say, cars, for example.
Yes, it talks specifically about pedestrians and bikes before it gets to vehicles.
Okay. What do other commissioners think about that? Commissioner Clark.
The hierarchy was one of the things I liked the most from the Palo Alto objective standards. I think that is something I would want to exist in any project anyway. And so if it's feasible, I think that I would support incorporating it. But I'd definitely be curious to hear staff opinions and if that seems too restrictive or anything like that.
What is staff's reaction to the suggestion?
Thank you. My initial reaction is this is one of those examples that comes out of Palo Alto's contextual design criteria, and it may be difficult to objectify a hierarchy of priority between different modes of travel. We certainly will take your suggestion and look into it. This is one of those examples where it may be a little difficult, but we'll see if there's a way to do it that is objective. In the end, going back to the definition of these objective standards, it can't allow anyone to really think about it, if you will, or make a decision on whether they've adequately addressed the hierarchy. It needs to be something like, this is out of left field, but all mixed-use projects shall include a Class 1 bike lane on the street-facing facade. It would need to be at that level versus all mixed-use projects shall prioritize pedestrian to bike to cars in that order, because there's no way to quantify that as did the developer meet that standard or not. But it's something we can look into.
Okay, I think that's fine, and I think there's a couple of commissioners that think that it would be good to go in that direction if we could, but we understand there might be some concerns about whether or not you can make it objective. Okay, any other comments on the pedestrian access section? Okay, then I think we can go on. All right, so
vehicular access.
Okay, so we just have the one standard for vehicular access.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, this is going to bring up like what's left out. If I recall, we didn't have anything for bicycles in here. We only have pedestrian and vehicle, and then we're going right into parking. Is that correct?
Correct. We don't have any bicycle specific standards.
Okay, so question for staff. I mean, I've seen like for LEED standards, for example, you know, you have to have if you want to get LEED Gold certification and stuff, you have to have like bike lockers or things like that. You know, bike parking in parking lots and parking garages and so on and so forth. So, is there a reason, or is there another place that we would have standards for how projects are supposed to accommodate bicyclists?
Thank you, Chair. Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. A couple things. For the bikes, obviously we have a bicycle and pedestrian master plan that Parks and Public Works deals with, which obviously has different right-of-way improvements depending on, you know, the street and what kind of improvements they're looking for moving forward. Those, you know, bicycle storage components are required in other documents by other agencies as well, as far as whether it's LEED or things that you need to do to show that you're providing, you know, X number of bike parking spaces, you know, per either square foot or per vehicular parking spot. And so there are actual specifics. And I can't recall off the top of my head, there may actually be some of those in the building code as well. So, you know, those are the types of things that, you know, again, from an objective versus aspirational criteria, you know, those are kind of two different topics. So we definitely can, as Sean mentioned on the previous item, we can look into options for creating those. I think the challenge is, you know, once you start, which is what we tried not to do, is capture every objective standard from the zoning code, every objective standard from every other document, and pull it into one document. Because then every time we make a change in one, we have to make a change in all of them. So that's definitely something that we can look at. But I think the important component is, it sounds like there's an interest to make sure that we're either capturing here or it's captured somewhere else. Kind of two topics on this relating to bikes. I think it's the, you know, the bicycle infrastructure from a public right-of-way standpoint, as well as bike storage mechanisms.
Right. So, I mean, from my perspective, and then I'm happy to hear from other commissioners as well. From my perspective, if it's of interest to the commission, and it's in the Palo Alto standard to prioritize bikes and pedestrians over other forms of vehicles. I mean, one of the ways that you're not doing that is by not calling out things that are in our objective standards that are pertaining to bicyclists. So that being said, I mean, I understand that there are stuff in other documents, but I feel like that might be a miss, that we should try and put something in here, even if it's about bike parking.
More clearly describe that this is not it's a standalone document, but it's not that there are other complementary documents that should be referred to that also contain objective standards. And you could name the various documents that exist. I mean, I would list them. There's what, a dozen or so, half a dozen. That way, to anyone's concern that we're not, that we're silent on it and that we don't address it because it's not in this document, we've said that go look for it in the appropriate document elsewhere. And I would feel comfortable doing that rather than duplicating the items that are already objective standards in other documents, as you know, for the reason just mentioned. Having said that, I think in this particular case, I haven't thoroughly read the Palo Alto guidelines. I was confused about the contextual guidelines and the objective standards, so I kind of got mixed up in that a little bit. But if we, I'm not clear what prioritizing pedestrian, bicycle over vehicles, or pedestrian over bike over, you know, I'm not sure what that means, but I would say in this instance that something about bicycle, accommodating bicycle, just, you know, putting some objective language in here just so we cover all the modes of transportation. So that at least is complete. I don't see that that's going to be a need going through this document, but I think it makes sense here. It's sort of an obvious omission, even though, as you say, we've got it covered in other documents.
Well, and I kind of have a feeling our vice mayor might be saying, who's avid bicyclists will be bringing up something similar when the town council sees it. Okay. As far as vehicular access, I think that's what we have is fine. It keeps, it's intended to keep circulating in the parking garage from going out into the street. So that makes sense. Any other thoughts about vehicular access? And then I guess, is there more parking location and design on the next page?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Landscaping. Pictures. I mean, it looked like to me like, most of the things as far as parking of vehicles was there. But then I thought about bikes. So I already brought that point up.
So move along.
Does anyone have any comments so far on the parking standards? And then there's parking structure access. Commissioner Jana.
When we get there, just a comment on utilities.
Okay. Any other commissioners that have comments on parking or parking structure access? Okay, utilities. And then it goes on to the next page. So Commissioner Jana.
Yeah, when I read 5.1, I thought those are really huge light fixtures. So I think you're missing a word. Light fixtures shall be located at a minimum of 3 feet and a maximum of 15 feet. I think that's what was intended, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Could staff answer that question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just rereading it very carefully.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the intent here is actually for pedestrian lighting along pedestrian paths. That the 3 feet is a minimum height, and then a maximum height of 15 feet. We weren't, this wasn't speaking to the distance between or the placement of the actual fixtures. So you could imagine the path lighting that's incorporated into a bollard versus like the light fixture shown in the figure on the next page.
I understand what you're saying. I'm just reading this literally. It says the lighting fixture shall be a minimum of 3 feet and a maximum of 15 feet in height. That describes the light fixture, not its location. It's a nit, sorry.
I understand the recommendation. I'm going to make sure to note that. Thank you.
I actually think there's some merit to thinking about adding or tweaking one of the standards. I mean, because one thing that, especially with all the dark skies advocates that we've had during the general plan hearings, there's nothing in here that would prohibit someone from putting, like, say, path lighting every foot. So the height is only one aspect of it, but like we just landscaped our own yard and put some path lighting in, and we put it like 15 feet apart from each other. So I would recommend maybe adding on to 5.1 or something like that, just to make sure that they're not doing excess lighting in height or in volume. I don't know if it's possible to make that objective, but it's, yeah, some other ones in there, but when the parking lot is so long, you do a landscape strip or something, it seems to me you could make that objective.
We've noted that, and we certainly can look into that.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can look into it. Of course, the spacing will depend somewhat on the style and height of the lighting itself and the brightness of it. So we can look to see if there's something that to be included.
Okay, all right. Any other comments? If you could you scroll down a little bit? Okay, so that's everything on utilities through 5.3. I remember talking about the screening. So then the next thing is landscape and screening. Any comments on landscape and screening? Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments in under A6, and I think again at A9, we talk about plantings. And I know we spent a lot of time in our general plan discussion talking about using native plantings and all that. And I just wanted to confirm, we don't have to reinsert that language into this document. Is that correct? Because the general plan is a more restrictive document in that sense. And then those standards would carry it into this document. Is that right?
It would depend on how it's written in the general plan. If the general plan, and I'm sorry, I don't have the language in front of me, but if the general plan states something similar to native planting is highly preferred by the town versus native species shall be incorporated into all landscape plans. The first is a subjective criteria and couldn't be applied and wouldn't be applied under a project like this. The second would be objective, that statement, and you'd have to meet that in addition to the landscape and screening requirements here. So if there's a wish to be more restrictive or to create something objective that doesn't exist or only exists in a subjective form in another document, that's the type of recommendation we would certainly entertain.
Perfect. Then my thought, and I would welcome the thoughts of my fellow commissioners, would be wherever landscaping is discussed, and again, my notes indicate at least sections A6 and 8.9, that there would be either a requirement or a preference for native and drought tolerant plantings where possible. And then as long as we're in the same section, then section 6.2A, when we're talking about screening, it calls for a solid masonry walls, and we're talking about in the buffer between a multifamily and a residential building, a single family residential building. And I'm just curious why a masonry wall was called for. It seems to me maybe regular fencing in certain circumstances might work and might fit in better aesthetically in some neighborhoods than a solid masonry wall. I suspect a masonry wall probably has some sound attenuation benefit to it, but aside from that, is there a reason to use masonry as opposed to allowing some other forms and materials?
Thank you. So this is an example of an objective standard that was created from language that already existed. And I can't remember the exact language. I'd have to look up the source, and we can certainly do that. But there is a current requirement for a masonry wall when you are interfacing between, I think it might be commercial and residential.
Correct.
So this is where that was born from. And the caveat here would be if we created an objective standard that was less restrictive than an existing objective standard, that could be problematic in conflict between the two documents. We're looking a little bit farther forward as we consider this. So we've tried to maintain it at least the level that was existing somewhere else, if not more restrictive within this document.
All right, well, that's a fair comment, and thank you for explaining that. So I'll withdraw my recommendation then on with respect to the masonry wall, and then just preserve my comments with respect to the plantings.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, who go ahead.
Sorry, I can't find my raised hand thing. So I just want to go back to what Commissioner Raspy was saying about landscaping. We actually can't write sentences that say things like where feasible, because that just opens up two opinions. That's not objective. And I think, but I think we can still investigate the whole idea of native and drought tolerant. And I think one of the ways into it might be the C3 guidelines, which are already in effect townwide on certain kinds of projects. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at it, but I just want to make sure everybody knows that we can't use sentences that say things like if feasible or as necessary, things like that.
The town council was just going over the general plan on Monday, and I don't have my general plan in front of me, but I want to say that that we actually had that the plantings have to be in a category of this or this or this. But if it is, then I would say that Commissioner Raspi's suggestion, we ought to, make this a bit more robust. And then as far as the other, the comment about the masonry wall, if that came from an existing document where it's between residential and commercial, is there a way to just make sure that it's clear, or is this going to apply for if there's two residential buildings that are next to each other, that they're going to have to put a masonry wall?
Tom, can you scroll up a bit? Because this is a subpoint underneath a previous policy that does specify that it's between residential that abuts or multifamily or mixed use development abutting a residential property. So any of these higher intensity projects that abut a residential property would have this requirement.
Okay, so it is clear that we know what the context would be. Because I had the same reaction that, because especially in planning commission, we're always hearing about fences or, screening trees or this and that and the other thing. But if we already have that in another standard, then we don't want to be inconsistent. Commissioner Clark has her hand up, so I don't know if you wanted to comment on this or something else.
Yeah, I have two comments under landscaping. So first, just to jump off of what Ms. Armour was just saying. So in that case, if it's between a multifamily residential and then like single family, does that mean that theoretically a duplex next to a single family home would need a masonry wall, or where does the line kind of exist for that?
So based on the earlier discussion, I think one of the things that we would work on developing is a more specific definition of qualifying projects so that we could make sure that it is clear. It may be that there will be some references to state regulations, but make it clear as to which projects are considered multifamily for this type of policy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to make sure that we flag to not have a wall between like a duplex or a fourplex and a single family home, because our whole goal this whole time with missing middle has been to have it kind of blend in with the neighborhood. So that might be for a different conversation, but just to kind of raise that. And then Chair, may I ask another question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So then my other question is on 6.1. Just it says that the area shall be landscaped, and I was wondering if there's a definition of landscaped kind of sitting anywhere, because I felt like that could be up to interpretation.
Thank you for that question. Sorry, Tom, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I was probably going to defer to you. I mean, it could be left up to interpretation. However, I don't know if it's defined in the code, if it's one of the definitions that's already given.
And I was going to say that it's something that we did discuss, and this is where we landed. We could certainly look at it a little bit more carefully and see if it needs to be a defined term.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually was having the same reaction. I was like, oh, it could be a pile of gravel, a bunch of mulch. It could be all hardscape. I mean, I'm not, maybe those are all in the desirable category, but that to me, I would think that would be worth looking into if it's clear enough what it would be. Commissioner Raspi.
Thank you, Chair. One more comment with respect to landscaping, and that's in section 6.3. The language provides for a minimum height of 3 feet with landscaping between parking lots and streets as serve as kind of a visual buffer. I was wondering if we wanted to create or insert a maximum height as well. I mean, there could be aesthetic reasons and safety reasons to create maximum heights, but it occurs to me there also are security reasons. If we create hiding places or little dark corners in parking lots, is something we certainly want to avoid, I think. So for security reasons, if for no other, we may want to insert a height limitation on the buffers around parking lots.
Thank you. And I would just quickly respond that part of what you'll see that's duplicated in this document in the town code is some of the regulations for fencing, because those were just updated back in 2019. That included a maximum height in basically the setback areas that are adjacent to streets. So that's a street side or a front setback area, and areas that as you get closer to corners or driveways. So now that it's codified with a maximum height of 3 feet, and that's where we started here. But that is something that we could clarify and duplicate, so that we're calling out that you've got to be at least 3 feet. But if you're in the setbacks abutting a street, then no higher than 3 feet.
Great, I think that'd be helpful. Thanks so much.
I think that's a very good suggestion. I did want to make one more comment about the wall thing. I think that Commissioner Clark's comments were right on, and I know we can do something about it. But the other thing that I thought of is, since we're trying to promote affordable housing, it might be onerous, especially if you're looking at a 2-unit next to another 2-unit, to have to build a wall, because it would be more expensive than planting and things like that. So I just want to make sure that we're really careful about when under what circumstances a wall is required. And then that's it. Anyone else have questions on the landscaping or comments? Okay, so then we go to fencing. And then staff, you did mention that most of this is taken directly out of our fence ordinance.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there won't be any conflict between this and our fence ordinance.
Correct.
Did I move on?
I don't think anyone else has any questions about or comments on fencing. Retaining walls.
And Chair, I would add also that this does come almost directly from the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines for retaining walls.
That's correct.
I mean, going back to Ms. Quintana's questions, I know we've already made this as a recommendation, but I mean, like, since we're taking this stuff out of other documents and putting it in here, it does beg the question of why we're not taking other things out of other documents and putting them in here that are clearly objective standards. So I know you guys are going to look into that, but do any commissioners have any questions about the retaining walls? Okay, then open space. Commissioner Clark.
Thank you. I have a question about the relationship between 9.1 and 9.2. So if a mixed use development has to have at least 20% of the site area be landscaped open space, and then also has to have a minimum of 100 square feet per residential unit of public gathering spaces, do you think that this becomes burdensome on them, or like staff from your experiences, do you not see this as a problem?
So I can start, and I would say that as we look at this wording, it may be that in some cases, these two policies would actually overlap in terms of space that's required for common open space could be some landscaped open space. And so it may not be additive, but it could be, it would overlap. And Mr. Ford, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on those two.
No, I think the primary thing we were trying to do was cover two different development typologies. One being a 100% residential project, and another that would have that mixed use component, assumed probably on the ground floor. So we were just trying to make sure, we were trying to separate them so that it got handled first in 9.1 as just a overall standard, but then 9.2 augments it in terms of talking about when you have these two uses occupying the same site. That's all I can offer. And then we were also trying not to conflict with anything that the code already specifies in terms of open space requirements.
Staff, do we have other, do we have anything in our code on minimum open space?
We do. The code does have specifics for multifamily developments in terms of the amount of space for each unit, private open space, as well as common open space. And so those would apply. This is looking more at the project as a whole rather than individual spaces.
9.1 is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to tell you, I for one was really happy to see this, and you know, when we talked about it, because I mean, one of the really nice things in the North 40 specific plan is the requirement for 30% open space, of which 20% has to be green open space. And I'm glad to see that we have something in here. I did, before I go on to any other questions, I wanted to ask the question though about the 9.1. It says landscaped open space maybe. Is that objective, or is it have to be one of those, or what else could it be if it's not one of those?
The 20% of the site area is the objective part.
Okay.
The landscaping may be in these other forms, gives examples of what it might be, but does, you're right, leave it open. We were talking earlier about the possibility of defining what landscaped means. And so it may be that would actually increase the objectivity of the second part of this, but it is still an objective standard because it is saying it must 20% of the site must be landscaped open space.
Yep. Well, I mean, and now that we're in this drought crisis, having grass in here is not a good thing. So I think that if you're going there, that we should work on this one a little bit. Commissioner Clark, did you have more comments than what you already asked about? And I want to just make sure we covered everything. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to quickly respond to staff's response. So I think something that I'd recommend is just making the potential for overlap between those two a little clearer, because when I saw them, it felt like they had to exist in separate silos. So that's something I recommend just exploring.
Good comment. Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to echo your concern about grass. You know, whatever's appropriate in this drought tolerant foreseeable future, I think we need to be respectful of. Also in 9.2, 9.3, and 9.4, I noted in the Palo Alto, some areas, excuse me, where they speak to the common area being open to sky. In some areas, it's 60% open to sky. So I would recommend going, excuse me, looking for those objective criteria and speak to the open to sky. Thank you.
So are you suggesting adding something because it talks about a minimum of shading? You're talking about some percentage of open sky?
Yeah, but just refer you back to the Palo Alto objective standards on open space. They do speak to open sky concept in addition to coverings.
Okay. And so, and you're recommending that staff look into adding that here? Okay, all right, yes. Good. Sorry to make you keep talking. Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, in the recommendations I made concerning the Palo Alto Objective Standards, number 8 addresses private open space. And it appears that the draft that we have only refers to public open space or common open space. And I noted Ms. Armour said that there's code language that addresses private open space. I haven't had a chance to look at that, but I thought there were some good suggestions in there in terms of size and location.
And I would offer and remind that the code requirements for private open space would still apply. in those circumstances. You're correct. This is speaking more towards public or common open space. The open space requirements for second story units usually exist in the form of a balcony or a private balcony, which is not defined here, but we can look into including it or making sure that we have enough here. We would still want to be a little bit careful with duplicating items that are in the town code per Director Paulson's caveat earlier.
Okay, well, I think just to make sure that anything that Palo Alto had that might not be in our current code, since we're not looking at it right now, I think would be a useful thing to check on that.
And Chair, you're speaking specifically to number 8 in Commissioner Barnett's
yes.
Attachment. Okay, thank you.
Yes, yeah. And then I that actually maybe when you talked about the balconies, it made me think of something. When we had the draft 2040 general plan and the community design element, we did have, and I know the then Vice Chair Janoff and I had recommended taking it out, but there was a requirement for when it was multi-story to have a balcony, and that could be included in the common open space, and you needed to offer it because they were stories above the ground. And what ended up happening with that, because that was an objective standard that we had in the general plan that we kind of referred out, and what did we, I don't remember what we decided about that or what happened to that.
I believe that was part of the list of topics that were considered by the subcommittee. Because all of the things that we removed from the general plan as too specific at that point or inconsistent with code were brought, at least considered initially as part of this process.
Okay.
That would have been part of the Gpac referrals. Sorry to jump in.
So I don't remember what we decided, but I'm asking the question why am I not seeing it here?
I don't, this is Tom Ford. I don't recall why it's not here. I would say though, that if somebody has a balcony on an upper floor, that's only private. You would not be able to count that as common open space because the unit is the only person that has access to it.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that, but I think the issue was that if you're going to create a multifamily building, that you want to give the residents an opportunity to have some private open space.
Thank you,
Right.
Chair. I would just offer that right now we're looking at the site standards. That definitely is something we should probably consider if it's not in there for the building standards, which is section B.
Okay, yeah, so maybe I missed that for, maybe it's in the building section. Okay. All right, any other comments on open space? Okay. Building placement. Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. Just keeping it short here. I was curious why 10.1 only referred to development in a community place district. When we look at the site inventory that the HEB has prepared, there are a number of developments that are outside of the community place district. So just curious whether this really is intended for only that or whether it's for more than just the community place districts.
I don't recall why exactly we did that, other than it could be that was the only place, the community place districts were the only places where we were envisioning ground floor commercial in a mixed use context. That's the only thing I could think of offhand.
And to Commissioner Janoff's point, I think maybe that's too limiting. So we probably just strike that so that it would apply to any multifamily or mixed use. So I think that's a good comment, and I think you'll probably see that in a couple places. So we'll strike that wherever that occurs in this document.
I think that's a good suggestion. Commissioner Clark and then Commissioner Resby.
Thank you. Just to give another perspective. So for me, I had only liked this one knowing that it was in community place districts, because I think normally, like, I don't want to see everything, especially not 75% of everything coming right up to the setback. Or this one's hard because if that is mostly what another neighborhood is like, then I think that makes sense to do there. But if that doesn't exist in some places and you start doing it, I think that could make them look out of place. And so for me, I don't personally think that's one that makes sense as an objective standard for everywhere.
I'm going to ask a question on top of Commissioner Clark's question and comment. Could we make this like just specific to mixed use? Because I know where this came from. It was when we were talking about during the general plan about kind of creating communities, and we also talked about this during the redesign of our plan development ordinance. We have a mixed use development on the northwest corner of Blossom Hill and Los Gatos Boulevard, and that is kind of a non-vertical mixed use, and the first thing you see in a lot of parts of it is parking lot. And so when we were talking about the re-envisioning of what might happen in these community place districts, to have them be mixed use, where it's close to the sidewalk and is accessible and everything made sense. Would it make sense to just change this to a standard for mixed use versus, because any place there would be mixed use would have ground for commercial.
So
go ahead.
I was going to say that yes, we could, as with some of the previous standards where it referenced mixed use projects in particular. One caveat I would say in some of our recent discussions about the housing element and housing developments, and whether there's a possibility that for certain affordability levels, say it's 100% affordable housing, that could then be allowed without a mixed use component in one of these commercial zones. And so if it didn't have this requirement, then it could be jarring on the street if we're trying to create this continuous streetscape. So those are some of the things to consider. We can't think of all possible situations when we're doing objective standards, but something to consider.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Resby, do you want to comment on this, or did you have something else?
No, on this one, thank you, Chair. First, I join in Commissioner Clark's comment. The notion of a requirement of 75-foot frontage seems to me maybe not ideal in all situations, and so we may want to consider a limitation on that. But it also seems to me that it perhaps creates a conflict with some of the designs that are possible. So I'm skipping ahead, unfortunately, a little bit to the building design section, but the building design in B1 sub D, where it has the sheltered walkway within the building, I think that wouldn't be permitted if we had a requirement of 75% ground floor use on the setback. So I just want to make sure internally we're not precluding certain building designs with this requirement.
Well, if I might interject, it's just saying a minimum of 75%. So in the case of the arcade, that would be what we've drawn there is 100%, which is more than 75.
Well, on the arcade, aren't you have zero, don't you? Because there's no ground floor in the setback. It's all removed from the street.
Oh, well, I consider the build to the front of the arcade, the one that establishes sort of the street frontage.
Yeah, in my mind's eye, I see the posts as not part of it, but the
Oh, okay, that's a good point.
And I would jump in and say that typically those posts would be considered part of the structure and would have to meet setbacks. So in the case of the arcade, if that were built to the setback line, that would qualify or comply with A 10.1. It's a little bit of a nuance. If you look at a single family residential, when they have a porch projecting off the front and you have those posts are the edge of the building and would be required to meet the setback, and that would be similarly applied here. We could look at another way to revise A 10.1 if there's still the concern about the 75%, but I just wanted to add that.
No, I appreciate the clarification.
I do think that I'll go back to Commissioner Janoff in just a second. I do think that some clarification is needed, to address the concerns of Commissioner Clark and Commissioner Respi, and to make sure there's no conflict. So if maybe we take out community place district, but if we should be specific about what kinds of sites we're thinking of. Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that when thinking about modifying 10.1, a big focus in the general plan was street activation. And so these concepts of bringing the building to the street and creating a pedestrian access was a highlight. And so as you think about ways to modify it, just keeping that in mind, that was sort of an objective throughout the portions of the general plan that spoke to these sorts of developments.
Yep, I think that's a good comment, and that is exactly what the intent is. And I was actually really glad to see this in here, but we just have to make sure we don't have unintended consequences. Commissioner Clark.
Thank you. Yeah, just to kind of hop off of that, I think that there's a chance it could make sense to just say mixed use for this, because, for example, if there was an affordable housing, non-mixed use development, maybe it should have a front yard or things like that. And so I don't know if that's taken into consideration already for this, but I think that kind of is an example of what concerns me about it.
Yep. Well, if it was 100% affordable and it was on Los Gatos Boulevard, for example, and it was next to a mixed use development, then, but I think that's the concern. Well, let's just leave it with staff to try and, figure out a way to either limit it to mixed use or whatever the context we could have to make sure that we're not creating unintended consequences. But I definitely think we should keep this. It's just a question of making sure that it isn't creating the thing that we don't want. Ms. Armour.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to say that at this point, because of the number of comments and suggestions and requests for additional information, it may be that it makes sense for us to continue this discussion. And once we get through the document, then to continue to a date certain and have staff come back with some of this so that you don't feel that you need to be working out the specifics tonight as much as giving direction to staff so that we can come back with some specifics for you to consider.
Okay, I think that's a good suggestion. So do you want us to go through the rest of the document, just take comments and then not trying to bring it to closure because we know we're going to continue it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Okay, I think that's a good way to handle it. Okay, so we're on page 822, so let's keep going. And there's site amenities for mixed use. And then that's the last thing on site design, right? So
Correct.
This is taking us to building design. Okay, any comments on Commissioner Clark and then Commissioner Respi?
I have a question for this one. So in terms of it having to implement a minimum of 3 of these solutions, I know that these are objective standards and that this might not be possible to work in, but I still just wanted to voice my concern that I think that there's a chance that it could look that some of them could look a lot worse with 3 of them than with 2 of them. And I'm not sure how to reconcile that or anything, but I kind of felt like looking at each of these 3 could be a lot. And that might also just be something that we could request some pictures of examples of things that incorporate all 3 or something like that.
And Tom, you may be able to pull up a couple of the parallel pictures, if that is helpful to look at these concepts in particular. Admittedly, the first few times that we scrolled through this document, it's hard to tie to what Tom just brought up here, concept B 1.1a. But when you see it actualized, done in good architecture,
Right.
it's a little bit easier. And it may even be something to look at a concept image like this and look to see if of these 6 items, are 3 of them present on just this image. And I maybe there's 2, maybe there's 3, but some examples may be helpful.
Right. So for instance, on this example, they've got, 2 different materials, one of which is at least 30%, which I think is one of our standards. They have a setback on the upper level of part of the building. They have ground floor awnings, which is another piece. So there's a number of different things that get implemented here, but we were trying to talk about just this one specific thing. Here's another version. The front massing, it steps back quite a bit, and they've used that step back to have an upper level deck. So I think Commissioner Clark brings up a good point about maybe 3 is not the right number, but maybe 2. But as you can see, really, really good architects are able to do all of it, multiple standards in one building.
Okay, and then a couple other commissioners have their hands up, and so they may want to comment on this or something else, but I'll go to Commissioner Raspy and then Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you, Chair. I actually had the same comment as Commissioner Clark. It seemed to me that mandating a minimum of 3 different setback or demassing requirements didn't necessarily work in all situations. If, for instance, you had 50 foot of frontage, 3 different articulation methods could be distracting. And so I would encourage staff to look at that. And the thought off the top of my head is perhaps anchor it to how much street facing there is. So for instance, for 50 feet, you would have 2 different requirements. If you went to 100 feet, maybe 3 different requirements, something so it wouldn't be so disjointed in a crammed area that it becomes more problematic. It doesn't solve the problem that we're looking to solve, that is de-emphasizing the building. So just a thought, but again, same general concern as Commissioner Clark was.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Commissioner Janoff.
Actually didn't have that concern at all. And I'm thinking that to Mr. Ford's comment that good architects know how to incorporate these. I'm just glancing at Palo Alto, they're requiring 3 or more. So this may be something standard with developers, and I would defer to staff if this is, sort of common to have a set of objectives like that. Having said that, if it becomes overly burdensome to a developer because they've got to have all this, more expensive design features, and that deters them from the project, then I would say that that's an issue. So I personally, before changing it, I would want to hear more from. I would want to hear from Eden Housing. I would want to hear from the people who are trying to do the hard work of the affordable housing and see whether these are unreasonable expectations, because that could fall into the category of government being too onerous in their standards.
No, that is a good point, and I think if you from what I can remember of the affordable housing complex at the North 40, they would have at least 3 of those. But my sense was that they would have 3. But let me go back to Commissioner Clark.
Muted.
I think you're muted, Commissioner Clark.
Okay, my Zoom crashed. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so I was just gonna say I completely agree with what Commissioner Janoff was saying. And so I first wonder if you talked to any developers in the creation of these objective standards. And then also just want to say that I think regardless, that's something I'd like to see as we move forward with these is actually hearing from developers, like, are these too stringent? Would this deter you from developing in Los Gatos and maybe make you go somewhere else? Does this make sense? And that sort of thing.
Thank you. And I would say in response that we reached out, staff maintains a list of architects that do a lot of work in the town. And we included them in our outreach efforts for our community meetings. We didn't get much participation from them. I think and then we also included them in the notice for this meeting tonight. And I only heard from one of them that they planned to attend. We will continue to reach out to the design community and look for opportunities to increase their involvement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe going to them with a few specific questions like this that they can just send a reply to or something could be a good way to increase engagement. I know that's very difficult.
All right, that's a good suggestion. And since we're continuing this to a future meeting, maybe, I don't know how much time there will be for doing that, but Director Paulson has his hand up, and then I'll go to Commissioner Respy.
Thank you. I just want to remind folks too, is we've got the objective standards for the streamline process for the qualifying projects. But if you have an architect or a site, for instance, that maybe one or more of these ultimately become insurmountable from a design perspective, they always have the opportunity to go through our standard process. Now, obviously, the whole point of some of these objective standards, especially when we're talking about affordable housing projects, that's what we want to do, is we want to help streamline those. But for a standard mixed use project, if it's on a constrained site, to Commissioner Raspy's point before of, you've only got 50 feet of frontage on this building because the lot's so small, then if they're not able to come up with solutions to these, then there is always an option. So I want to make sure that everyone, just remind everyone that if they can't meet this, it doesn't mean that they can't do a project in town. It just precludes them from going through the streamlined process, just as kind of a high level comment.
Would it be too much to ask to use the example of the North 40, the affordable housing project that is being built over the market hall, and see if they've already done that, or how hard it would be? I mean, because that would be an example in our town.
Yeah, we can definitely take a look at that, and we'll work with Tom and with staff and see how many of these, I can't remember how many, A through F or whatever it is, how many of those characteristics were they able to incorporate as an example?
Without having the standard in place, but chances are they probably already did stuff like that to make it not look like a big box. Commissioner Respy.
Thanks, Chair. It just seems to me that this is, harking back to one of our earlier discussions, this would be a good section of the document where we could have examples, more maybe finished renderings of buildings that incorporate 2 or 3 or even 4 different of these elements together. I think it would be helpful to have a good visualization of combined elements and single structures as we go through the process. I think that might be useful as well.
Good suggestion. Okay, why don't we go on, because we are going to see this again. So
just go on to B2.
Yeah, because those are just individual examples of those 6 things. But I think the point about seeing them in a single structure examples would be helpful. So then we're on 8.2, right? Parking structure design.
Right, B.2.
Okay, any comments on parking structure design B2? Commissioner Clark.
Sorry, so many comments.
It's okay.
I wanted to ask about 2.3B. So saying that the entire articulation change of 25%, I just felt like that's a very specific number. And I wasn't sure if that is intentional or if that's something that, you know, is pretty normal or anything, but I just kind of wanted to flag that and ask about it.
Sure. Well, if you look at the body of 2.3, we stipulate the 25%. And the way we originally wrote B, 2.3.B, we didn't say it down there, and staff brought to my attention, somebody could read this in a way and not cover the entire articulation. So what we're trying to say is that 25% of a facade, if it's greater than 40 feet in length, needs to have one of those two things. And it's not enough just to introduce a second material, but you have to do it over that entire 25% articulation.
Okay. And does it make more sense to say 25% than to say like 25 to 50%, for example, or anything like that?
Well, by the way the 2.3 body is written, it says at least 25%. So it wouldn't prohibit you from doing it for 50%. We could either introduce that same language here, or we could just make it known that if you, so long as you make the 25%, you're there.
Yeah, I think adding at least would be perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other commissioners have comments on B2 parking structure design? Okay, then we can go on to B3 roof design. Any comments on roof design? Okay, it looks like everyone's okay with that.
Still in roof design, but a different page.
Yep. Any comments on and this second part of roof design? Okay, it looks like that's okay.
So this is the last section, but it's a pretty long section, and there's a lot of illustrations. But the facade design and articulation, comes out of a lot of discussion by this subcommittee.
Yep, we spent a lot of time on this.
So here's another one where 4.1 sets the general rule, and then there's 4 options, at least 2 of which you need to accomplish. Actually, there's 5 options, but only 4 of them are illustrated. The 5th one's pretty obvious.
Okay, but they have to use at least 2 out of 5.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to guess that since no one brought it up, that would probably be helpful because of the discussion we just had, to have an example picture where at least 2 of these are combined on a actual building that we could see.
Okay, let me just, you mind if I just take a moment to see if we've done that? So this one is doing it in that it's got that modulation, both lower and upper, and it also has a balcony. So in a sense, maybe they don't have enough balconies, but they've done 3. Here they've got a varying roof line. They've got modulating the mass out. They've made more of a top to the building. They've articulated the base. They've accentuated a corner. Here they've not only put balconies, but they've also modulated the upper level massing. And they've also introduced a second material at I can't say what the percentage is, but it's a pretty significant percentage of the entire facade. This is a pretty long facade, and so they've broken it up, but it's done by a very, very good architect. But again, it's a number of things. Taller ground floor, glass. Anyway, we do have some images, and I think we can just find a way to bring those forward into a document.
Sounds good. And then Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. My question has to do with varied plate heights. I think in several of the examples you showed and you commented there were different heights. I'm curious why varied plate heights isn't one of these criteria.
I don't know. It could be. I don't know if that's what I meant when I said that. I think I was trying to say that they didn't just have a 12-foot ground floor. They had a 20. It looks like it's more like probably at least 18 to 20 feet ground floor height. That's what I meant. I'm sorry. And I don't know if there's any place in our document. I don't think there is any place where we specify a minimum ground floor height. We might have left that to the zoning ordinance, particularly in a mixed use context.
The reason I mention it is because several of these examples illustrate different plate heights. Even the Palo Alto example at on page 9, I don't know what it is, but it's showing a slightly higher plate height from the first floor and then shorter going up, which is the reverse of one of the examples you provided, where you've got the taller plate height or the illusion of a taller plate height on the third story of that first illustration you showed. I personally think that the variation in plate heights is really interesting, and it makes for a dynamic architecture. So I'd be in favor of including that if that made sense to staff.
The only thing I would say, if you don't mind my interjecting, Chair, a developer, needs to make the building as inexpensively as possible. And I think if there's a lot of different, you're on the third floor, and then suddenly it goes up 5 feet, and then it's, changes, it could just make the floor plan a little bit more expensive to execute, but we can look into it.
Yeah, I would just say if this is one of several options that they have, then you're not forcing them to go that route. Just as an example, the senior community that my mom lives in, the top floor, the third floor apartments have 11-foot ceilings and in interior 11-foot ceilings, and so you can see that from the exterior of the building as well. It looks interesting and it looks elegant.
Okay. Commissioner Respi.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question going to section 4.2. Again, we're in the building design and articulation. The language says buildings shall incorporate the same materials on all facades. And then if you look at, for instance, the language directly above it in 4.1E, it calls for one of the articulation and design methods is the use of at least 2 different facade materials. So it seemed to me there's some inconsistency internally in the document. So I'm not sure exactly what 4.2 is trying to say. Is it trying to say that it's going to use the same, a building will use the same facade materials all the way around its face on all corners or on all faces?
Correct. It could be that we've not written this clearly enough, because really what 4.2 is trying to achieve is what they call 360-degree architecture, so you don't treat your front facade with all the good stuff and then the other 3 you don't care about. So I would read this, but it's probably not written well enough to do this. I would read that if you had 2 materials on your front facade, then you need to have those same 2 materials show up on the other 3 facades as well. That's the goal here. It's not to say, it's not to conflict with each other, to have to E, 4.1.E specifying 2 materials and then 4.2 just saying 1 material.
Right. So I actually agree with your point that you don't want the stick-on brick, for instance, on the front facade and then plaster on the other three faces. But I'm not sure we want to also limit our builders to say you have to use the exact same materials on all four exterior walls. I mean, there may be some design reasons why you want one side looking slightly different than the other side. So that's just my thought. Maybe we should give a little bit more thought to 4.2.
Okay.
Thanks.
I will say this, that we have 360-degree architecture in the idea of it in the community design element of the general plan draft that's being reviewed. So, I mean, I think that there's merit to that, but maybe there's a better way to say this so that it isn't in conflict with other things. Commissioner Janoff.
I was just going to echo the same thought. And many of the projects that come before us, you know, one of the issues is, oh, well, you haven't carried that design element 360 degrees on all surfaces of the house. And so that is part of our standard. And so I think this hung me up a little bit too. And then I realized, oh no, that's not what they mean. They mean whatever you do on phase 1, you do on phase 2, 3, and 4, or however many. So I didn't have a problem with it, but it probably could be clarified. And maybe it makes sense to have some duplication of the materials, but not all of the materials. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. I've put that back to staff.
Yep, I had the same thought. Maybe that if you had to use the same material on all four sides, it didn't have to be 100% in the same way on all four sides, or something like that. But maybe I'm sure staff and our consultants can figure this out since we're going to see this again. Any other questions on this section? There on number. We had a community comment on the point system. This is the first time we've seen the point system. Everything else was choose from a menu. This one is choose from a menu, but that certain things have more points than others. Have you? And I assume that this has been used to other places. This kind of thing's been used other places successfully.
Yes, it's also sort of the way some of the lead standards work.
Yep.
And the goal for us was to leave as much flexibility as possible to an architect. So instead of coming in here and saying your facade has to have an arcade, your facade has to have a belly band, bay windows, what we decided to do was try to establish there's two parts of building the standard. One is what is the right minimum point threshold that they need to meet. And so we chose 12. And then you generally sort of weight the improvements, if you will, or the articulation pieces as to how difficult they are to achieve or how much effect they have. And so what we tried to do is certainly weight it in such a way that you couldn't just do one and get to 12 points. You had to do at least 2. And if you only did 2, they were probably at the top because those are the most points. So that's kind of how, we went about constructing this.
Okay. I actually like this, assuming that it would be reasonable to architects, which had been brought up before. But I like the idea of this, and it looked like it gives you a lot of options about how to go about creating variation in the facades, which is something we would all worry about, especially with bigger and multifamily and mixed-use developments.
Right. If you think back to that first photo I showed of the Mark Steele building in San Diego, he probably has about 40 points because he had balconies, he had a change of color, he had a change of upper level floor, he probably had a belly band. So he had awnings and canopies. He had a lot of different things going on. He would have had no problem with 4.3 on that building.
Okay. Any commissioners have any concerns about 4.3? Then there, on this page, there's also 4.4 and 4.5. I don't see anyone with their hands raised, so we can go ahead. We're getting close to the end. Can you stop there? I thought this one was kind of confusing. So it was the columns part that kind of messed me up. So I see in the picture it has the example of the materials changing at the inside corner. But like, how would you do that with a column?
All right, architectural features. Oh, so that's just saying, for instance, if you had, you know, if you want to call these columns, they're not, but that you could change your material here, you know, but not like here, but you could use the column to make a change. So because the column would be a significant enough piece on the facade that it's a logical pace to break.
But it's talking about a corner, yeah. So that I was confused where the column would be.
Well, inside corners or at architectural features that break up the facade plane.
Okay, so it's either or. Okay.
But I mean, maybe we've overwritten this and made it more confusing than it needs to be.
It might have just been me. Commissioner Janoff.
An illustration would help.
Yeah, an illustration of the or of the columns. Okay. Because I totally got the inside corner material change, but I didn't get I was trying to visualize the column and it just wasn't happening for me. Vice Chair Barnett.
Yeah, going back to 4.3, if I might, it addresses only the street-facing facade planes. And it occurred to me that if you had two large buildings adjacent, that you would be looking at sort of a bare facade except for the fenestration. And I wonder if consideration should be given to the other sides of the building.
Staff want to comment on that? Would we be covered by 4.2 as rewritten?
Well, that was our thinking, and our thinking, because we did discuss this quite a bit in the context of the 360 concept. And what we didn't want to do was start requiring all of this sort of architectural embellishment, if you will, on every facade. So this was just supposed to be street-facing facade with this point system one, but we were hoping that 4.2 would carry enough of the idea around to the other sides of the buildings. But you certainly wouldn't have a chimney on all four sides of your building. You wouldn't necessarily want bay windows on all four sides. So it could be that we need to do more thinking about 4.2 rather than trying to establish 4.3 as something that happens on multiple facades.
That'd be appreciated. Thank you.
I think that would be fine, is to think about 4.2 because that already came up.
Sure.
Okay. Any other comments going through 4.6? Okay, and then we got 4.7. All right, meaning one of those standards. Okay. I didn't have any issues with this one.
And 4.7 has two parts. So it also has, a minimum amount of glazing. And I think I looked really quickly at that long Palo Alto document last night. I think they were using a 60% minimum as well for glass.
I thought this was all fine. Do any commissioners have any question, concerns about what is written so far? We're on the second to last page. Okay, and then there's 4.12, 4.13, and 4.14. Vice Chair Barnett.
Yeah, slow on the draw today. Going back to page 19, I just noted that the Palo Alto objective standards spent quite a bit of time talking about entry dimensions. And I wonder if that would be worth considering.
Sure, we can do. I think I saw that, this dimension right here, how deep and how wide. Correct? I think I saw that.
Yeah, it's tied to, I think, the number of units and the use. It's like the intensity of the use, essentially. The more units, the wider the entry.
Yeah, the only problem with that, just to play devil's advocate, I don't have a problem looking at it, but the door is only going to be, the door is either going to be 3 feet or 6 feet, it's not like, okay, you have a 3-foot door, but then if you have 12 units more, you're going to have a 4.5-foot wide door, unless we're talking about the vestibule. So
I think it's talking about the vestibule, so the door and the side lights and things like that. It's more about the defined entry and the importance of a more defined entry on a building that serves more folks.
Okay, I see.
Well, it sounds like there might be some stuff in the Palo Alto standards and that you've already looked at that that could be helpful to make it more robust.
Right. We actually were tracking their project progress, and so we actually used some of their earlier draft of their objective standards as some of the case study material. So when you saw some of those massing articulation standards that we had, we were keying into some of the things they were doing.
Okay. Vice Chair, did you have more back on the earlier pages? I didn't want to go through it quicker than you guys were ready for.
I'm good now, thanks.
Okay. Any things on 4.12, 13, or 14? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I think this has been a very good discussion. Do we need to staff make a motion for a continuance?
Yes, and we would recommend a date certain of July 27th. If we need more time, we could continue it again at that point.
All right, that sounds like a good plan. So would one of the commissioners make a motion to continue this to a date certain of July 27th? Commissioner Raspy.
Thanks, Chair. I move that we continue the discussion regarding the Town of Los Gatos draft objective standards to our meeting of July 27th.
That sounds good. And is there a second, Vice Chair Barnett?
Second the motion.
Okay. And then we'll just go ahead and call the question since we've already had lots of comments. Commissioner Raspy.
Yes.
Commissioner Clark.
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. And I'd like to thank staff and all the commissioners for their excellent comments. And I think I look forward to the next meeting when we get to follow up on some of these items that we've discussed and come up with a better result, or an even better result. Vice Chair Barnett.
Yes, I was wondering if we could be presented with a red line for the changes before the meeting. That'd be appreciated.
Is that feasible, staff?
I believe so, yes. We'll take a look at what the changes that we end up making and try and provide a red line and a clean copy.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Then we have a couple more things to go over in the agenda under other business. And first would be the report from the Director of Community Development.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep it pretty quick. just want to mention that the town council did start their discussion of the draft 2040 general plan and environmental impact report on Monday, the 20th, and they made some great progress going through each of the elements, but did continue it for additional discussion, and that will be another special meeting. That'll be Thursday, June 30th at 7 p.m. And so everybody is welcome to continue to join us for that discussion. And we do expect there will likely be an opportunity for additional public comment, but that will be determined by the mayor at that time. The other meeting that I want to mention is that the HEB will be meeting next on July 7th to continue their discussion from the last meeting. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that. And so then the last thing on the agenda will be the subcommittee reports and the and any commission matters that any commissioner wants to bring up. In addition to their service on the planning commission, every one of our planning commissioners serves on a different committee. And in our case, this includes the General Plan Committee, which is taking the form this year of the Housing Element Advisory Board with some additional at-large members in addition to the General Plan Committee. There's also the Conceptual Development Advisory Committee and also the Historic Preservation Committee. And since our last Planning Commission meeting, we haven't, the Housing Element Advisory Board hasn't, actually we did meet. Okay, so the Housing Element Advisory Board did meet on the 16th, and we started discussing the goals and policies. And as Ms. Armour said, that we're going to continue that discussion on July 7th because it's a pretty big topic, and it's kind of the meat of what would help make the RENA target happen in terms of policy and things that we decide. So that's the Housing Element Advisory Board. And then either the Historic Preservation Committee or the Conceptual Development Advisory Committee meet in the last 2 weeks.
CDAC has not met.
Okay. Historic Preservation.
Commissioner Raspy, do you want to give the report?
Sure. Yes, the HPC met this afternoon. We had 7 items on our agenda for this afternoon, 2 requests for removal of the inventory and 5 requests for minor alterations to residences. So again, the last month or 2 different sessions have been exceptionally robust agendas for us. We'll see if that trend continues. And then as one kind of subtext item, we're seeing more requests for applicants seeking to use substitute materials instead of wood. Technology has advanced such that there are interesting wood replacement products. And so as an HBC, we're working together with staff to see how those should be used and whether the residential design guidelines should be updated accordingly.
That's great. It sounds like you're had very robust meetings and also are coming up with some things that might be helpful to include in some of our town regulations. Are there any other commissioners that had anything for commission matters? All right, I'm not seeing any. So I'd like to thank all the planning commissioners for their contributions, and I'd like to thank staff and our consultants as well for the objective standards portion of the meeting. And we will have our next meeting. I believe we are meeting the second Wednesday in July, which will be the 13th, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. All right. So our next meeting will be on July 13th. And with that, I will call this meeting adjourned, and we will see you all soon.